Hey, today I want to talk to you about learning in programming languages, the intermediate problem, learning, past the initial tutorials and learning things that are hard, like Rust as opposed to like JavaScript, right? Or TypeScript type system as opposed to using Ruby, and how you can get better at it. But first, a sip of coffee. So this all came up for me when I saw this on Reddit. This person said, I've been learning Rust for the past 3 months, and now comparing it with my experience of learning C++, I think that it's a lot more difficult. There's so many rules that you need to understand efficiently program in Rust, including ownership, the borrow checker, cargo, lifetimes, traits, generics, closures, unsafe, Rust, etc. Interesting example, right? Because he's comparing Rust actually to C++, which I would also say is a quite complex programming language. Has a lot more going on in some ways than Rust. But I think the point holds for Rust and C++, that it's hard at first to learn a language when there's just a lot of stuff, right? It can be a cognitive overload, and it's easy to go through a tutorial that can maybe teach you one specific thing, but when you want to pull it all together and build things yourself, it can become a bit overwhelming. So the way I think about this problem always has to do with this slide from Brian Cantrell, because I think it's so valuable explaining this issue, right? Some programming languages are designed to be approachable. That's this first value here. That means just easy to get up to speed with. It's easy to approach it, to come at it as a beginner. And programming languages that do that, historically, they get a lot of adoption because you have a growing base of programmers, and if they go to something that is the most approachable, they're going to have the best time, right? Python, for instance, was the successor of this language called ABC, which was a language explicitly designed to teach. Most people today start with one of these languages like Python that is very shallow, right? Python came out of just being a way to learn programming, but in fact, it's one of the biggest programming languages ever just because of its approachability. Right? A shallow learning curve just makes it easier to use a language initially. Designing a language is all about trade-offs. If there's a shallow learning curve, if there's not a lot to learn before you can get started, then it's just easier. Whereas if your language, instead of favoring approachability, favors something else on here, like expressiveness, right? Expressiveness being like, you can very concisely say complex things, Haskell, right? Scala. Or if it is important, rigor, right? Before I even run this program, you got to make sure that there's no memory leaks. You got to make sure that there's no race conditions. You have a borrow checker, etc. You put a lot of emphasis on rigor, approachability suffers, right? That's just more you need to do before you do the first thing, right? So these are software platform values, and the values all have trade-offs. Values have trade-offs, and approachability benefits adoption. But it harms reliability sometimes, right? You can't have that rigor at the same time. So languages take a different approach on this, right? Rust and Kotlin and whatever complex languages, they have a lot of newcomers struggling to learn them. It can be intimidating and demotivating that things are so slow at the start, right? But once you get past that kind of intermediate area, then sometimes you have a lot more tools that you can play with, right? So it's that intermediate stage that's really tricky, right? You can read a tutorial on Kotlin, but then when you go to build something yourself and you're like, well, how do I do this? I have a result type, or do I use exceptions or whatever? That's when things get tricky. But I think this has gotten a lot easier because of one very specific change that's happened in the last couple of years, right? LLMs like ChatGPT. You can use ChatGPT, you can use an LLM to help teach you and walk you through this intermediate plateau. That's what I want to talk about today. So this all relates to what I'm calling the intermediate problem, right? Imagine that you choose Rust for your next big project. You're ambitious. You're ready to build a ray tracer, right? Ray tracer is a pretty cool project. If you haven't tried it, rays of light hitting off objects and making a picture of what that looks like in a three-dimensional space. So say you've built that in another language. Now you want to build it in Rust because Rust promises of speed and safety. You think it's going to be awesome. You've done some tutorials, you've read a book, but as you start building it on your own, you hit a wall, right? You get errors, you're not sure what to do, you're not sure what libraries to use, you're not sure what to pull in. This is what I call the intermediate problem, right? There's this large volume of material you need to grasp to get through this intermediate learning stage. And like the deeper the language, the more libraries, the more obscure the problem you're working on, the longer this plateau is. And a lot of people just never make it out of this plateau unless, sometimes experience from other languages will help you cross over. Or if you've just been on this journey and been like, hey, I know there's this middle part and it kind of sucks and I'm just going to work to get through it. But a lot of people don't do that. They just bail, right? The intermediate plateau, can be deadly. That's just a fact of life. Because as you find yourself wrestling with Rust's ownership rules or deciphering compiler errors or trying to understand how to efficiently manage memory, the problem isn't just coding anymore, right? It's about learning how to think in Rust. And it can be a frustrating experience. You go from a beginner who's kind of, confident in what they can do to just there being a lot of real world problems that you hit upon. That is tricky, right? You quickly encounter barriers. You hit a wall like, oh, this approach isn't going to work because I have circular references or whatever, right? Sometimes Stack Overflow can be really helpful if it's a specific problem somebody had before. But a lot of times you're not asking about bugs, right? You're not like, oh, I encountered this problem. You just don't know quite the way to approach a solution. It's like, bushwhacking through a jungle. There's many ways that you can possibly go through there, and some will be dead ends. And if you need to find your own way, if you don't have somebody to help guide you, it just can be confusing, right? There are traditional ways to solve this problem, right? One is mentorship. One is just a coding buddy, someone who can work with you on the problem and guide you to get through it, right? So that is just my suggestion today. Surprise, surprise, is going to be using an LLM, using ChatGPT as intermediate coding buddy, right? Because the problem with Stack Overflow and mailing lists and forums and Reddit for getting past this hump is that the speed of feedback can be slow, right? If I hit a problem with how to do my ray tracer, I can write up the issues I'm running into and how I've designed it. A couple paragraphs with some code thrown in. Sometimes just writing things up like that will make things click and you can rethink it. But other times you need an answer for that. So you can take that question to Stack Overflow, although it might be closed as off topic, or, Reddit for your specific programming language, or just if you have a buddy who works in the language, you could DM him or post it on a Discord channel, wherever. The point is you need to get somebody who has more experience to look at your problem and tell you like, oh, you should be going this way, or you're trying to do X, don't do X. The problem is that can be slow, right? If you're just working on a side project, you want to make progress. Every time you hit a wall, you need to wait for Reddit responses. You need to wait for Stack Overflow to close your issue or whatever it is, right? But at an intermediate level, you can use ChatGPT to do something like this, right? You can use, there's several tools, but mainly just ChatGPT by itself. You are stuck on some problem and you just ask ChatGPT, like, here's what I'm trying, here's the error I'm getting, here's the problem, right? You just do the equivalent of a Reddit post, but you get your answer instantly. I mean, sometimes you can hit the limits of knowledge and get non-helpful answers. ChatGPT or Anthropic's Claude or whatever, it can just hallucinate a library and say, try using this. That's a real thing that can happen. But at the level of an intermediate, when you're trying to get through this plateau, most of the stuff you're asking about, there's lots of information online, and ChatGPT will be able to confidently answer. It can stand in pretty well as an intermediate for you, an intermediate coding buddy. Once you're an expert and you're building the most complex things, it might be less useful. But at this stage, it could be super valuable because it's read most of the internet. And if you're hitting a problem that people have hit before, it can put together a specific answer for you that helps answer your question in a way that's easier for you to grasp without the underlying background that you'll need to get through this intermediate plateau. And yeah, these tools are interesting. They can help. Aider works in like your VS Code or actually in any project, and you can ask it to make changes. It will get your entire code base as a prompt and then make changes. This LLM tool, that's Simon Wilson, I believe. It's just a command line ChatGPT, so you can ask it real quickly, like, hey, what's the command for git to delete the branch I'm on, and then create a new branch off main with the same name, etc. Universal Primer, I'll put these links somewhere. Universal Primer is a ChatGPT extension, a GPT that focuses on not just answering your questions, but trying to explain to you the basics of where that concept comes from and, give you more educational knowledge than just specifically answering your question. But really, just opening up ChatGPT or your tool of preference and, pretending like you're going to do a Reddit post where you describe your problem, include your code, and send it off works really well. In fact, whenever I tell people this, they just say like, well, I don't know. I guess people are of two thoughts, right? Some people have tried this like I have and find it really useful. Some people are like, nah, like it's not worth it. I got a bad answer once. It's a waste of time. I'm too smart for this tool or whatever, right? And to those people, I want to say that Terence Tao, the smartest mathematician alive, has been using ChatGPT to do this, right? Here's something he said recently. He's using ChatGPT to consult on a proof that somebody asked on Math Overflow, right? So there's some interesting details on this. He asked ChatGPT, don't act as an expert, act as a collaborator, and we can brainstorm things together. And they had a conversation back and forth, which he shared. It suggested a couple of approaches, one of which ended up being the solution that worked. So yeah, if this works for Terence Tao, it's probably going to work for you. So I thought I would just show some examples of this working, right? So let's go back to the beginning again. Here's the problem I had. I had this Rust solution put together, but I was getting an error. And so I sent ChatGPT the code along with the compiler errors and said, like, how do I unwrap this result, right? And it said, here's a solution, which you can see I'm quickly going through. But I didn't like the solution because of how it unwrapped the results. It gave me another solution. And then I said, okay, I'm having some performance problems because I was doing this Python calling Rust thing. How can I fix that? And it suggested, how I could build a flame graph. And then I ran the flame graph and it wasn't highlighting the areas I said. And it's like, okay, well, maybe you need to inline the methods because the way I was calling things, Rust was not inlining. And so it was highlighting slow areas that weren't particularly part of what I was. It wasn't a representative test, right? And so it suggested like, oh yeah, you need to use the release flags when you profile because otherwise, it's just highlighting problems with a non-optimized version and so on and so forth, right? This helped me get to the bottom of the solution. And it's just having a conversation with, ChatGPT asking for help. I just thought I'd share these because it is a thing that I do all the time. And I know that some people do not. And I just wanted to show like it does work. You just need to communicate, right? Here is my problem. And then it suggests a solution and like, well, would it be better to do X? Like, well, you could try X. Just back and forth, right? It sounds obvious. Maybe it is, but I thought I would just share, right? Another example I had right here, I wanted to use poetry. I had this monorepo set up where there was Python in a subproject that had dependencies. And I wanted to use poetry to manage them, but the problem was how to make it work in a monorepo, right? I wanted to be able to do poetry run and then run the thing way down there, but I didn't want to, version all my dependencies up at the top level, right? I wanted to have specific dependencies for various parts of the monorepo, if you know what I mean. And then it suggested a solution, but then once I did that, I needed to rerun like poetry install every time I ran something. Blah, blah, blah. So I asked it for an improvement. It's like, yeah, you can use this develop equals true when you install your monorepo sub dependencies into this top level thing. I mean, the details aren't important, but it slowly walked me through. Here's how you can use poetry in a monorepo with multiple specific solutions that each have their own dependencies, but you can still call poetry from the top level and it will all work, right? Worked great. Something I didn't know how to do, right? Something that would have taken me a while to look up and find various solutions to. Here's another one, right? So I had a bunch of code that read some user input and I said like, how should I fix this? This is a mess, right? And it suggested like, oh, there's a bunch of different libraries you could try from Python. And I said like, okay, well, I'm using Python 3.11 and, I want something that's well maintained. And it said like, well, here's how you would do this. Here's how you do it in PyInquirer. Here's how you do it in this other library. And I think I just ended up picking the one that was Prompt Toolkit, which is very simple. But I didn't know what all these libraries were. And it was helpful to be able to have this back and forth and say like, okay, well, which ones of these are updated? Which ones, are not too heavy on the dependencies because I don't want to buy into this whole framework. I just want a simple way to have structured menus at the command line. Anyways, simple example of just building things, right? By learning things by building something, and then when you hit a barrier that you encounter, you just have your coding buddy, which in my case is just ChatGPT, and you use it to fill in some of the gaps. Works amazing, right? A question though that you might have is, doesn't this suffer from just making you not a good learner, right? The realistic concern for this approach, right, is not that ChatGPT isn't helpful to get you through this zone, because I think it is, and if you don't think it is, I suggest just give it a try. Communicate, spend some time back and forthing. The real issue, right, is that it could harm learning, that I won't have learned the things that have gotten me far, right? It's causing an atrophy of my skills because I didn't choose between all those libraries. I didn't learn the background of them all. I outsourced some of that, and without building that knowledge, it's hurting my progress. So actually, I did look into this, contrary to the often held belief that the best way to learn comes from grappling with hard problems alone, like furrowing your brow. Learning research suggests that guided learning is actually the most impactful way to learn, especially in complex fields. There's this educational psychologist called John Sweller, considered very important person with important research in the field of learning. But he showed that being walked through a solution by someone else is often the best way to learn something, better than figuring it out on your own. One of his examples that I recall is just, if you're teaching students computer programming, you could throw problems at them that needed to be solved using recursion, and eventually maybe some of them would come up with it, right? And they could learn that way, and they would struggle through and get it, right? But he found it's actually much better if you can have a guided training where you're like, here's a solution, here's a way we can solve it with recursion, here's a solution, here's a way you can solve it with loops or whatever, and guide people through these solutions. And then when you give them actual real world problems, because they've moved through these guided solutions, they can do a lot better. He uses words that I find a little confusing: manage intrinsic load, decrease extraneous load, increase domain load. Mainly it means that when you're learning a complex topic, it can just be overwhelming. It can be cognitive overload. There's too many things to learn, right? Like I need to figure out how to use poetry. Well, should poetry be the right tool? Should it be something else? I'm trying to use a monorepo. Is that the right way to do it? How do I stitch these things together? Actually, having a guided answer to a specific solution can be really valuable. It can help you remove some of that cognitive load. I don't have to understand every little nuance, and it just gives me some wins under my belt where I'm building up some skills. Another way that this is thought about by another researcher is the zone of proximal development. So when you have a gap in your knowledge, questioning ChatGPT can provide a well-structured explanation or a step-by-step breakdown of the problem, right? So it's not merely providing you with the answer, it's unveiling the underlying logic, because of this and that, here's why this might happen. We went pretty quick through it, but when I was asking about the Rust results and how to roll them up, because I had two things that both could error and how to combine those, ChatGPT was explaining to me, like, here's how this works and here's how you can collapse these together, etc., right? And that guided learning is important, right? It's kind of like a book written just for you on the problem you're trying to solve that's just in time generated as you go. So here it is in the zone of proximal development, right? So you have in the center the things that you can currently do, right? And then on the outside, you have the things you can't do. And this middle zone is where an LLM can be useful, right? Learner can do with guidance. So here, my guide is my ChatGPT, right? This is called scaffolded learning. A scaffolded learning experience is proved to be valuable in learning because you can close that intermediate gap. You try to build something beyond your abilities in this middle zone, right? You hit gaps, you get guidance, scaffolded learning, and if the educational research is correct, you can accomplish things you can't accomplish without that guidance. And you're not cheating, you're learning, you're building up new skills, because as you spend more time in the zone, hopefully it expands this inner zone, right? You're learning when you're out here because you're not being overwhelmed. There's not too much cognitive overload because of the guidance, but expands this inner zone as you spend time in this middle zone. That's the theory, at least, or my understanding of it. Basically, try something hard, lean on an LLM or a tutor, and you will learn the tools and techniques via that collaboration process that allows you to get beyond your current boundaries, right? You're building up confidence at being in that area. Which brings me back to the original idea, right? There are certain programming languages that are very approachable. There are certain languages that focus on rigor or expressiveness. They're more complex, they're harder to approach, right? And if you're learning a programming language for the first time, yeah, learn Python. But what I want to say is, like, if there's something that seems hard that you were afraid to try, or something that you tried to learn before and bounce off of, and in my case, I'm using Rust as an example, but I also struggled with Haskell development in the past, it's now easier, right? You can use an LLM as a coding buddy to help take you through, right, that guided zone and help expand that inner sphere and that middle sphere out into the outer sphere. Steep learning curves are now just a lot less steep. You can try something, hit a barrier, get help, backtrack a bit, make sure you understand it, and then charge ahead, right? You can push out into this proximal development zone. Or if you go back to Terrence Tao, he kind of expanded on how this was helping him, right? Terrence Tao is now learning to use Lean, which is a programming language for writing proofs that's known to be quite complex. And he said it's ChatGPT, GPT-4 has been helpful in helping him clarify the Lean syntax, because he's a smartest mathematician alive, but he was not an expert in this proof language. ChatGPT is helping him as a tool into that middle zone, right? Terrence Tao even went on to write this article for Microsoft called Embracing Change and Resetting Expectations, which I think is saying in better and more words what I'm trying to say here, right? Steep learning curves just got a bit shallower. We now have some tools to tackle these steep climbs to guide you through these processes. And I'm super excited about it. Not everybody is. But like, all I'm saying is just build something, right? Build something with Rust, build something with a Camel, build something with Elixir. The intermediate problem is sort of over, or it's a lot decreased, right? Your coding buddy can boost you over hurdles, and pretty soon you'll be jumping those hurdles on your own. And like, all this stuff's only getting better, right? Programming languages can be more expressive and more rigorous with steeper learning curves because we can get over them, right? Coincidentally, if you are working in Rust, especially if you're doing CI in Rust, like, builds can be a little bit slow. You should check out Earthly. We have this great librust project which can take your Rust builds and make them a lot faster. When we've tried it in projects in the past, we've been able to take builds, quite easily down from like a 15-minute time to like a 5-minute time, which can be quite impactful. And even if you're not working in Rust, like, Earthly works with whatever programming language you are working on, probably works with your own CI. I work for Earthly. They're the reason I'm making this video, and it's awesome. You should check it out. But yeah, most importantly, just build something cool, right? Is there a project or that you tried to do in the past that you were not able to complete? Maybe leave a comment on the video. Is there some programming language that you found too complex? Try these things, right? Let me know what you're running up against, and I think you'll get a lot further this time if you just spend some time with a coding buddy. All right, thank you. Take care.